The voice that saved 148 lives. Sometimes, the smallest decision changes everything. This is the story of Batik Air Flight 6231. A flight that should have been ordinary, but instead became a miracle of survival. A journey where instinct, faith, and mystery collided with one of Indonesia's darkest days. On September 28, 2018, Captain Ricoseta Mafela, a senior pilot with Batik Air, part of the Lion Air Group, prepared his Airbus A320 for departure from Mutiara, Sis Al Jufri Airport in Palu, Central Sulawesi. With 148 passengers and crew on board, the flight was scheduled to head for Jakarta, the capital city of Indonesia. For everyone on that plane, it was supposed to be just another routine domestic trip, one of thousands that the airline operated under Indonesia's busy civil aviation system. The Directorate General of Civil Aviation, under Indonesia's Ministry of Transportation, oversaw operations at the airport. Air traffic control services were provided by AirNav Indonesia, a state-owned company responsible for the nation's air navigation safety. Everything that evening seemed normal. The weather appeared clear. The control tower reported no issues. Instruments on board the Airbus showed nothing unusual. By all accounts, there was no reason to expect danger. Yet, in the cockpit, Captain Mafela felt uneasy. He later described it as an inner prompting, a sudden, urgent voice within him. Not a sound from the radio, not a technical alarm, but something deeper. It urged him to depart early, to push forward without delay, against all procedures, against all standard timing. The voice told him, take off now. That choice? To trust something invisible, unmeasurable, and entirely outside aviation. Protocol would prove to be the difference between life and death. Because only minutes later, Palu would be struck by a catastrophic 7.5 magnitude earthquake. The earth would split, buildings would crumble, and the airport itself would be ripped apart. The tsunami that followed would kill thousands. But for Batik Air Flight 6231, already climbing into the sky, escape was possible. And at the heart of this miracle was one man's decision. The sacrifice of a young air traffic controller named Antonius Gunawan Agung, and the fragile line between tragedy and survival. This is the story of how 3 minutes changed history. On the afternoon of September 28, 2018, Palu's Mutiara Sis Al Jufri Airport was busy but calm. This small regional airport, overseen by Indonesia's Directorate General of Civil Aviation and supported by AirNav Indonesia's controllers, was accustomed to short-haul domestic flights connecting Sulawesi with the nation's larger cities. For the ground staff and passengers alike, Flight 6231 was nothing unusual. The flight was operated by Batik Air, a subsidiary of the Lion Air Group, one of Indonesia's largest airline companies. The aircraft, an Airbus A320, stood ready on the tarmac. Inside the terminal, families, students, and business travelers lined up to board, unaware of the disaster building beneath the surface of the island. The Central Sulawesi region sits directly on a volatile seismic zone, but no warning had yet been issued. Captain Ricoseta Mafela, a veteran with years of flying experience, carried out his standard pre-flight checks with his co-pilot. The fuel was loaded, the weather briefing reported stable skies, and the navigation systems confirmed a straightforward route toward Jakarta. Everything, from the passengers settling into their seats to the final boarding call, followed the expected rhythm of routine. The Indonesian Ministry of Transportation had invested in improving safety across its aviation sector after years of scrutiny. And by 2018, Batik Air had earned a reputation for reliability within the Lion Air Group. On paper, nothing about Flight 6231 hinted at danger. The crew's training emphasized discipline, procedure, and trust in instruments. Every action had to align with protocol. Yet, for Captain Mafela, there was something unsettling in the air. As the minutes ticked down to scheduled departure, he felt a heaviness, a warning without explanation. This was not something any checklist could address. There was no mechanical fault, no storm clouds on the horizon, no distress calls from AirNav Indonesia's tower. Still, the captain could not shake the sense that waiting would be dangerous. Passengers had buckled their seatbelts. The cabin crew, working under Batik Air's strict service standards, prepared the aircraft for takeoff. Everything appeared normal, but inside the cockpit, the captain wrestled with an invisible pressure. Training told him to wait for the exact clearance window. His instincts told him to act now. And so, even before the tragedy revealed itself, the seeds of a miracle had been planted. In aviation, discipline is everything. Pilots are trained to follow rules, respect timing, and never let emotion or impulse dictate their choices. Every takeoff and landing is governed by strict procedures enforced by airlines, overseen by national regulators, and monitored by air navigation authorities. For Batik Air Flight 6231, that oversight came from AirNav Indonesia, the state-owned corporation responsible for controlling the nation's skies. Yet on that day, Captain Ricoseta Mafela would make a decision that ran against everything his profession stood for. The official departure time had not yet arrived. The crew had minutes to spare, and no instructions from the control tower urged haste. By the book, the captain should have waited. The regulations of the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, under Indonesia's Ministry of Transportation, left no room for improvisation in such moments. Pilots were expected to wait for their scheduled slots to ensure safety and efficiency. But inside the cockpit, Mafela felt a pressure he could not ignore. He later described it as a voice, not from the aircraft, not from his instruments, but from within. A sudden urgency pushed him to act. Against all training, he turned to his co-pilot and instructed that they prepare for immediate departure. It was an unusual command. Pilots rarely, if ever, request early takeoff without operational necessity. The co-pilot, puzzled, questioned the decision but ultimately followed orders. As a senior captain with Batik Air, Mafela had the authority. And so, instead of waiting for the routine countdown of minutes, he pushed the aircraft forward 3 minutes early. Engines roared, systems engaged, and the Airbus A320 accelerated down the runway. At that very moment, the control tower gave clearance, one of the last communications that would ever come from the doomed building. Young air traffic controller Antonius Gunawan, working for AirNav Indonesia, ensured the flight was safely guided out. His actions, alongside the captain's intuition, would prove vital. For the 148 passengers, there was no sense of what had just happened. For them, the flight felt normal, smooth, even routine. They had no idea their captain had just broken with standard procedure. No idea that this one choice, to take off 3 minutes ahead of schedule, would place them safely in the skies while the ground below was moments away from disaster. In aviation, 3 minutes is nothing, but for Flight 6231, those 3 minutes were everything. At 6:02 p.m. local time, just minutes after Batik Air Flight 6231 lifted into the sky, the island of Sulawesi was shaken by one of the deadliest disasters in Indonesia's modern history. A powerful 7.5 magnitude earthquake ripped through central Sulawesi, its epicenter near the coastal city of Palu. The earthquake, recorded by Indonesia's Meteorology, Climatology, and Geophysical Agency, BMKG, was devastating. Entire neighborhoods crumbled as buildings collapsed. Roads split apart, bridges swayed violently, and power lines were torn from the ground. Within seconds, panic consumed the city. At Mutiara, SIS Al Jufri Airport, the very runway that Flight 6231 had just departed from cracked and buckled. Concrete slabs shifted, making further operations impossible. Inside the air traffic control tower, chaos broke out as the structure began to sway under the seismic waves. The controllers on duty, employed by AirNav Indonesia, scrambled to safety. But one man stayed. 21-year-old air traffic controller Antonius Gunawan refused to abandon his post. His responsibility was to ensure that Captain Ricoseta Mafela and his Airbus A320 cleared the runway safely. He maintained communication with the aircraft until the very last moment. Only once he confirmed the Batik Air Flight had departed did he attempt to save himself. But fate was cruel. As the tower collapsed around him, Antonius leapt from the 4th floor. The impact left him gravely injured. Despite emergency efforts by the Indonesian National Armed Forces and medical teams, he would not survive. His sacrifice ensured 148 passengers and crew remained safe in the skies. Later, he would be hailed as a national hero by the Indonesian government. The earthquake unleashed secondary horrors. Along Palu Bay, the shifting seafloor triggered a tsunami. Waves as high as 6 meters surged inland, swallowing homes, mosques, and markets. More than 4,300 lives would ultimately be lost, according to figures released by Indonesia's National Disaster Management Authority, BNPB. Thousands more were injured, displaced, or missing. For Flight 6231, now airborne, the passengers were unaware of the full scale of destruction unfolding below. The crew received fragmented updates. What they did not yet realize was how close they had come to catastrophe. Had they remained on the ground just minutes longer, they would have been trapped at an airport torn apart by nature's fury. In less than 5 minutes, the city of Palu was changed forever. And yet, by a miracle of timing, one aircraft had already escaped. 3 minutes in aviation, that is hardly anything. Planes wait longer on the runway every day. But for Batik Air Flight 6231, those 3 minutes made the difference between survival and certain tragedy. As the Airbus A320 climbed into the skies above Palu, the full force of the earthquake devastated the ground below. Mutiara Sis Al Jufri Airport, managed under Indonesia's Ministry of Transportation and supported by AirNav Indonesia, was torn apart. Runways split, cracks opened across the asphalt, and parts of the terminal collapsed. The control tower that had cleared, Flight 6231 for departure, crumbled into rubble. Had Captain Ricoseta, Mafela followed protocol and waited for his scheduled departure time, his plane would have been trapped. The runway would have been unusable, communication from the control tower lost, and the aircraft, full of fuel and passengers, left stranded in the epicenter of destruction. In such a scenario, even evacuation might have been impossible. Many lives would have been lost. Instead, the decision to trust his inner prompting had placed the aircraft safely in the sky. For the 148 passengers, many of whom were students, workers, and families returning to Jakarta, the difference was invisible at first. To them, the flight felt like any other. But when news of the earthquake reached them mid-air, the reality began to set in. They had escaped disaster by the slimmest of margins. In the days that followed, Indonesian authorities, including the National Search and Rescue Agency, Basarnas, and the National Disaster Management Authority, BNPB, coordinated massive rescue operations on the ground. The Indonesian National Armed Forces, TNI, joined international humanitarian groups like the Red Cross, UNICEF, and aid teams from Australia, Singapore, and neighboring countries to deliver support. Palu was devastated, but the story of Flight 6231 spread quickly through media networks such as Compass, BBC, and CNN. Aviation experts highlighted the extraordinary timing. To them, the case stood as an example of how instinct and human decision-making could override procedure in rare life-or-death moments. Batik Air and Lion Air Group publicly acknowledged the captain's decision, while the Indonesian government posthumously honored Antonius Gunawan Agung for his heroism. 3 minutes, that was all. 3 minutes was the thin line between a plane full of survivors and another entry in the long list of aviation tragedies. And yet, because of a decision that defied training and logic, 148 people lived to tell their story. What made Captain Ricoseta Mafela decide to act against procedure? For aviation professionals, the question became both fascinating and unsettling. Pilots are trained to rely on evidence, the data from their instruments, the clearance from air traffic control, the procedures set by their airline and by regulators like Indonesia's Directorate General of Civil Aviation. Yet on September 28, 2018, none of these pointed to danger. There was no weather warning, no earthquake advisory from the BMKG, no technical fault aboard the Airbus A320. By every official measure, the flight was perfectly safe to wait. But the captain later revealed that he had felt an overwhelming inner pressure, a voice he described that urged him to act. Some called it instinct, the sharpened intuition of a pilot who had spent thousands of hours in the skies. Others called it faith. Captain Mafela himself, a man of deep Christian belief, later told reporters he had been singing hymns in the cockpit before departure. For him, the decision to leave early was not just technical, but spiritual. He believed God had guided him to act at the precise moment needed. This claim drew mixed reactions. In Indonesia, a deeply religious country where Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism all have strong communities, many saw his survival story as divine intervention. Churches and prayer groups shared his testimony. At the same time, aviation experts warned against framing such decisions as repeatable. We cannot base airline operations on miracles. One aviation safety analyst remarked in Jakarta, but we can acknowledge that sometimes human instinct fills the gaps technology cannot. International media carried the story widely. CNN, Reuters, and Compass TV highlighted both the miracle of timing and the heroism of Antonius Gunawan Agung, the young controller who gave his life ensuring the plane's departure. The Indonesian government, through AirNav Indonesia and the Ministry of Transportation, formally honored Antonius with posthumous recognition, praising his dedication to duty even in the face of death. For the passengers, however, the explanations mattered less than the outcome. Survivors described the eerie feeling of learning, mid-flight, that their city had been destroyed just after they left. Parents hugged their children tighter. Businessmen, students, and workers sat in stunned silence. They had boarded a routine domestic flight and landed with a new understanding of how fragile life could be. Was it instinct? Was it faith? Or was it something that lies beyond human explanation? The story of Flight 6231 leaves the question open, but for 148 people, the answer mattered less than the fact that they were alive. Batik Air Flight 6231 landed safely in Jakarta that evening. For the passengers, relief and gratitude mingled, with shock as news spread of the devastation in Palu. They had left a city that no longer stood as they remembered it. Homes were gone, streets were flooded, thousands of lives had been lost, and yet, by a twist of timing, they had been spared. In the days that followed, Indonesia mourned. The National Disaster Management Authority, BNPB, confirmed thousands dead and missing. The Indonesian National Armed Forces, TNI, the National Search and Rescue Agency, Basarnas, and the police coordinated massive relief operations. Aid poured in from governments and organizations worldwide. The Australian government sent aircraft and supplies. Singapore dispatched disaster response teams. And international humanitarian groups like the Red Cross and UNICEF set up relief centers. Among the stories of tragedy, the survival of Flight 6231 shone as a symbol of hope. Captain Ricoseta Mafella was hailed as the man who listened to something beyond logic. His employer, Batik Air, part of Lion Air Group, publicly acknowledged his decision, while aviation experts debated the fine line between instinct and procedure. To some, he was proof of human intuition's power. To others, his survival was a reminder of the unpredictability of life itself. But the greatest honor was reserved for Antonius Gunawan Agung, the 21-year-old air traffic controller from AirNav, Indonesia, who died after ensuring the flight's safe departure. The Indonesian government, through the Ministry of Transportation, posthumously promoted him and awarded him the Bintang Jasa Medal for service. His name became a symbol of sacrifice and duty. Without his final clearance, Flight 6231's miracle might never have happened. Years later, the story continues to be told not just as an aviation tale, but as a human one. A reminder that survival sometimes hinges on the smallest decisions, on moments of courage, or on voices that defy explanation. For the families who welcomed their loved ones safely in Jakarta, the meaning of those 3 minutes will never be forgotten. Sometimes history is shaped by great battles or political decisions. Other times, it is changed by something as simple as a choice made in silence, a choice to trust, to act, to move. For Batik Air Flight 6231, 3 minutes defined the line between tragedy and survival. And in that fragile space, 148 lives were given a second chance. Sometimes, the smallest decision changes everything.